Hello, welcome. My name is Ellenor Alcorn, and I am an associate curator here at the Metropolitan Museum in the Department of European Sculpture and Decorative Arts. And this evening, my talk, I hope, will complement the exhibition that you've been seeing glaring at you from the screen, entitled The Wealth of a Nation, British Silver from the Museum's Collection. But it starts off on a bit of a tangent. And my title, of course, is also quite an ambitious one, The Usefulness of Magnificence. And you can see I'm beginning almost at the beginning of time. I promise you I'm not going to drag you through all the English sovereigns and their uses of silver, or we'd be here until the wee hours of the morning. In fact, I think I sort of tricked you into coming using that title, and then we're going to express, after reaching the early Stuarts, we're going to express through to George I and George II, because I think in many ways their acquisitions are best reflected in our exhibition. When Elizabeth I assumed the throne of England on the death of Henry VIII in 1553, she inherited, in addition to the responsibilities of a fractious and fragile kingdom, a vast treasury of gold and silver. Her father, Henry VIII, had been voracious in his acquisitions, buying tablewares, lanterns, writing sets, jewels, at the astonishing rate of about £3,000 a year. Henry VIII famously saw himself in competition with the court of France, where Francis I had attracted artists from abroad to help tout his own preeminence. And of course, Henry VIII was engaged in precisely the same maneuver. Here you can see a design for a cup by Hans Holbein, which the king presented to Jane Seymour in about 1536. Almost nothing survives from this vast and fascinating array of gold and silver. The two terms, gold and silver, are often jointly called plate, not meaning that they are plated silver, in fact, but derived from the Spanish term for silver, plata. So you'll often see and hear gold and silver referred to as plate, as a sort of blanket term. Most of what we know about the jewel house of Henry VIII or Elizabeth I is derived from fascinating and very descriptive inventories. But my point in speaking about this period today really is to show that the very elaborate protocols for acquiring and using silver at court were well established already by the mid-16th century. And although they were watered down and loosened up over the succeeding next 2 centuries, many of them remained very much in place. So how was silver used to serve the image of the sovereign on a national and international stage? As I said, the survival of works from the 16th and 17th centuries is extremely skimpy. But when we get to the period of George I and George II, of course, the survival, particularly of domestic silver, not so much court silver, is much greater. And I'm going to concentrate on the period soon after 1714, the moment of the personal union, when the Hanoverians took over the throne of England. And you're going to be hearing a great deal in the next few years. The 300th anniversary of the personal union, of course, is in 2014. So there will be several exhibitions to celebrate that, and you'll be seeing, I think, more of the silver, which has recently come to attention. So this fabulous spice plate in our own collection is one of a set of 12, engraved almost certainly in London, and by a very distinguished monogrammist whose name we don't know, based on the descriptions in the inventories of Elizabeth I. It is consistent very much with the character of the silver that was kept in the royal household. And in fact, the Tudor silver was legend in its own time and for a long time after. And that's a theme we're going to go back to in the 17th century and again in the 18th century. The renown of this great treasury established by Henry VIII and then built on by Elizabeth I. These spice plates are the set of 12 mentioned in the 17th century in the will of Anne, Countess of Pembroke and Montgomery. And the fact that she mentions them in the 17th century is interesting because it shows that she, 100 years after they were made, treasures them greatly. And they almost certainly were made. Here's a marvelous detail showing the quality of the engraving. The scenes are from Old Testament scenes, all from Genesis. Here, Abraham and Sarah are journeying through Canaan into Egypt. In the will of the Countess of Pembroke and Montgomery, she mentions my 12 spice plates and the ewer and dish engraved with the kings and queens of England. And indeed, it may be a little hard to make out, but you can see in each of the little roundels on the border and on the ewer that there are portraits of all the sovereigns of England from William the Conqueror to Elizabeth I. And you'll remember, of course, that it was not a casual thing to depict Elizabeth I. Restrictions of there were very strict rules governing who could and under what circumstances render an image of the Queen and how it could be disseminated. And this was all about, of course, the royal propaganda. At this date, in 1567, she was still marriageable. There was a lot of hope that she might marry and bear an heir, but of course she was getting a little long in the tooth, and so it was a controversial discussion. She's shown here as a young princess, in fact. But we don't know the exact circumstances of the commission of this piece, but it's quite clear with the portraits of all the sovereigns of England, and in fact Queen Elizabeth herself, that it would have been made for a very important presentation, either to the Queen or from the Queen, perhaps on the occasion of a marriage discussion or negotiation. Perhaps it was presented to her as a compliment in the hopes of firing up a marriage negotiation. The Old Testament scenes on the ewer emphasize its Protestant associations, which encourages us to think that it may have been associated with a marriage idea. The spice plates that I mentioned, just get those back for a minute, would have been used, if at all, in the very last phases of a meal, when they would have been brought to the table for the service of sweetmeats, candied fruits. They would not, and this tradition of highly decorated spice plates with either poetry or lyrics or imagery like this they were executed either in silver or in painted wood sometimes. But most importantly, as with other decorative plates of this period, they were intended, I think, to be shown next to the dining table and admired greatly by the diners for their fabulous workmanship. And this pertains also to this extraordinary Chinese porcelain ewer, also in the Metropolitan Museum collection, one of an amazing cache of 5 Chinese porcelain pieces with these beautiful silver gilt mounts. So this is silver gilt as in vermeil, that is, it's a sterling silver underlay with a very thin coat of gold. But most importantly, in addition to the rarity of the Chinese porcelain, which was almost unknown in England at this point, greatly treasured, there's the wonderful workmanship on these mounts, probably, in my opinion, by a maker who would have been trained in Antwerp. Certainly the density of the ornament and the engraving and the really beautiful, oh, I just ruined it, there it goes, the beautiful punched work around the foot of this piece is equal to, in quality, to the work that the Antwerp makers were making. Foreign workmanship was prized in London at the time, and in fact the specialists who came from abroad, Hans Holbein of course was one of them, but in all media found a ready market among the English nobility and indeed the court for their wares. Here is another bowl. These were, this whole set of 5 mounted porcelain pieces remained at Burghley House, one of the great Elizabethan manor houses here, built for William Cecil, Elizabeth I's most powerful minister, an extremely wealthy man, as you can see, by the scale of the house that he built. And so these porcelain pieces remained in the house until 1888. And either, we think, they were made, purchased by him, presented to him, or they might have been given to his son Robert by Sir Walter Raleigh. So whichever option you choose, it's a very distinguished source. And it raises the issue of the importance of gift giving in court culture. And in these inventories that I've described of Elizabeth I's collection, there's a constant record of who gave what to whom. And most significantly, the annual tradition of presenting very precious gifts at the new year. So according to the rank of the courtier, the queen would present often a gold cup or a silver cup filled with gold coins that were appropriate to the rank, and the courtier would in return give the queen a beautiful and precious object in exchange. The objects that we've been seeing, the spice plates or the mounted porcelain, are very much in keeping with the sorts of pieces that were presented under Elizabeth I as New Year's gifts. So I mentioned the buffet and the role of precious objects such as the spice plates to sit next to the dining table. Here is Holbein's drawing of Henry VIII dining in his privy chamber. And as I said before, there was a tremendous protocol well established about how a sovereign would dine. It was important for him to be seen in public so that his well-being could be assured by the members of his inner circle. Here he's attended by members of his court. He ate alone at a table with a linen cloth, and the buffet, the little architectural structure you can see over to the side, is installed with, you can tell even in this little sketch, Italianate objects. They may have been made in Italy, or they may be the sorts of English pieces that we've just been looking at, all inspired by Italian Renaissance forms. The buffet was an important part of the composition of the dining room at the time, and in general, most of the pieces on the buffet were not used or brought to the table, although occasionally a ewer and a dish, such as the engraved example that I just showed you, might be used, presented to the king or to the nobleman who was dining, so that he could ceremonially rinse his hands in scented rose water and wipe them on a linen napkin before the meal, a tradition that goes back to the Middle Ages with, if you can think of those wonderful figured animals, the aquamanile groups. So the tiers of a buffet were also established in tradition, and that remained very much a priority throughout the 17th and the 18th century. And across Europe, there were traditions as to the number of stages that a tiered buffet could be built according to your rank. So, for example, a duke could have a 5-tier buffet. A lesser nobleman could have a 3-tier buffet. Henry VIII, when he met Francis I at Calais with Anne Boleyn in 1532, was served next to a 7-tier buffet that was filled with gold wares, just to give you an idea of the significance of these objects. So the treasures of Henry VIII and Elizabeth I's jewel house were legendary already by the by the 16th century, when James I was forced, for financial reasons, to send huge quantities of these pieces to be melted down to recover the value of the sterling and of the gold. He had them copied in following sketches of the original form. So this extraordinary water pot, which is in the Kremlin Armory Museum, and it's a unique survival of the period. It's this big. It's actually an early 17th century recreation of what is essentially a Gothic object. And the so-called Great Gilt Cupboard of Estate, which was prized and cherished by James I and also by Charles I, unfortunately, was also sent out to be melted down. Some of it, in fact, by James I himself. So as the 17th century wore on, the royal treasury was subjected to tremendous vicissitudes, the melting down of much of the store from the jewel house, and under Charles II, the rebuilding of much of it, and then subsequently the remelting of it. And this is a fact of life with silver, as it's intrinsically valuable. It is among the first things to suffer when, in the case of war or indeed just national debt, it becomes too tempting just to send them to the melt. The Jewel Office was the division of the royal household that was responsible for looking after the crown jewels and all the objects in precious metals. So these were meticulously monitored, and anytime pieces were required for an event, a banquet, or to be used in the palaces, they were signed out in ledgers, and if any were missing, their loss was noted, and the balance sheet was equalized. In the early 17th century, in 1629, when some of the Great Gilt Cupboard of Estate had to be sold, the objects were sent to Russia as part of a commercial embassy where members of the Muscovy Company were trying to negotiate favorable trade treaties with the Russians. So this and a large number of other pieces, thank goodness, were taken to Russia, where they were not melted down, but in fact looked after extremely carefully. And the Kremlin Armory collection remains one of the great places to study these beautifully preserved examples of 16th and 17th century English wares from the royal treasury. So soon after these melts that I've mentioned, we begin to see celebrations of these lost treasures. And I do think that it became a sort of part of the national consciousness that these great glories of the pride of England had been sacrificed. And there is a kind of theme of nostalgia that goes throughout the 17th century, certainly, of course, with all the civil disturbances, but even into the 18th century, there's a longing for the glory days of Henry VIII, the simplicity and the magnificence. And that, of course, is contrasted with a strain of austerity and Puritanism that has, of course, with the dissolution of the monasteries and the sacking of and melting down of all the church plate, you get this sort of divided longings. On the one hand, a pride in the power of Parliament and the relatively diminished power of the crown, but on the other hand, there's a longing for those glory days of Henry VIII. So, for example, Sir John Eliot in 1626 proclaimed in Parliament, and he got in tremendous trouble for doing it, "Oh, those jewels, the pride and glory of this kingdom, which have made it so far shining beyond others. Would that they were here within the compass of these walls. Their very memory has transported me." So I think this is a thing to keep in mind as we move into the 18th century. Here's Charles II presiding over the Feast of the Order of the Garter in 1672. And you can see he is dining alone again, as Henry VIII had done, under a fabric and tapestry canopy that would have been richly embroidered with gold, and being served individually by his courtiers. And all along the wall here, under the windows, is a temporary table with a tablecloth that is set up as a buffet, and the wealth of the kingdom is being shown off to impress the diners, but also over the course of a banquet here at the table, which you can barely make out on the left, the diners are being served from that buffet. So wine and the wine is being served in from jugs, and the plates are being refreshed. So Charles II, too, and indeed James II here at the coronation banquet in Westminster Palace is being shown under similar circumstances. At the head on the dais is the newly crowned king, and the spectators, lesser nobility and favored members, were able to watch the festivities, while members of the court down below were served on this table, which would have been laden with food as the diners sat down. So here, this is from a sort of commemorative volume that was published to celebrate this banquet, and each of the numbers refers to one of the dishes, and there's a keyed guide walking you through the entire menu. Here is a detail showing the temporary buffets that were set up alongside the dining table with, you can see the display silver here, flagons for, didn't mean to do that, flagons for serving the wine, and this display plate here was probably not touched, but the food was served from the lower tier of the temporary buffet. So, what did it actually mean as we move in to the beginning of the 18th century that and the Hanoverians assume the throne of England, that there was this tremendous sense of loss. The great treasures of the Tudor crown had been melted down, was widely known, widely understood. The social turmoil of the 17th century, Cromwell and his reforms, Charles II's profligate spending, and he was seen as tremendously licentious and was criticized madly for the decadent nature of the court that he held. What did this mean to English citizens, but also to visitors who came by? In about 1700, a Spanish traveler said of Kensington Palace that it was beautiful but small and not a decent residence for a king. And in fact, when you think of Versailles, which was in its heyday at this period, none of the English palaces could match it, or even begin to approach it in scale, in grandeur, in their interior furnishings. This was a fact of life for the English. But the Jewel House did its best. Among its responsibilities, of course, was to furnish the inner circle with silver that would give them the stature that was expected of a government official. This is a dish in the museum's collection, made, I believe, for Joseph Addison, the writer who, for a brief period, had the position of in Parliament, of Speaker of the House, and it's very characteristic of the silver that was commissioned by the Jewel House. So a warrant would be authorized by the king, and the royal goldsmith would produce a piece such as this. Here we can really see the influence of the French court style, I think. You see the very familiar classicizing lambrequins around the border and the thick rope twist edge of this. This, again, is very much a sideboard piece, not intended to be used at the table for rosewater anymore, but a prerequisite for a grand dinner. And government officials each had an allowance of silver that they were authorized to receive, a smaller amount for a domestic government official, but the largest amounts were reserved for ambassadors who were dispatched to foreign courts. In this case, a large service that was issued to Sir Paul Methuen when he was dispatched to Spain in 1714. He and other ambassadors of the period were allowed to take with them 5,000 plus ounces of white silver, that is ungilt silver, and 2,000 plus ounces of gilt silver, which would have been used for the dessert service. So these very austere and plain casters were part of a very austere and elegant table service that was sent to Spain with Sir Paul Methuen. But we have to remember this is actually quite a rare survival because by virtue of their very plainness, they tended to be melted down. But if you think back to the image I showed you of the coronation banquet of James II and that densely massed table with all the plates laid out, this dessert service was part of a set of 17. And although the silver was not highly ornamented, they would have been loaded with symmetrically arranged mounds of gorgeous food, pickled or actually candied sweetmeats and plums and so forth. So it would have made an astonishing and impressive presentation. And it was extremely important for an ambassador to have to make, here we go, is the detail of the table arrangement that I mentioned. It was extremely important for an ambassador to represent the grandeur of the sovereign. This is a cup that was also issued for the same embassy, and again you can see the influence, I think, of the French court style. The Jewel House had the habit of reissuing examples of the same pattern. So there, after a while, you begin to see in the first quarter of the 18th century a sort of house style. And it's monumental. It's not so much intended for practical use on the table. It's quite sculptural. It's extremely heavy. It's handsome and beautifully made. It's a sort of corporate gift level of silver, very different from the more intimate domestic pieces that were made for daily use throughout the household. This is a detail of the arms of Thomas Wentworth, 3rd Baron Raby, who was sent to Berlin and later to The Hague. And he became voracious in his acquisitions, and he learned how to sort of play the jewel house to maximize the amount of silver that would be allocated to him. This is an extraordinary, massive silver cistern that was recently acquired for Temple Newsome House in England from Baron Raby's service that he had made for him before shipping out to Berlin in 1705. And he and his wife figured out how to, in fact, not even have the sovereign's arms engraved on the silver, but to have their own arms, which was a bit of a trick. And it shows that by this period, the stature of the court in these negotiations was, in fact, somewhat diminished. Here, finally, is an example of a cup, the same model that we've been looking at, but the Jewel House issued it as a christening gift to be marked, to be presented to Sir Richard Edgecombe on the christening of his son, George, named obviously after the king. So I show this just to show that the Jewel House had indeed a sort of a house style, and they reissued many of the same models. So by the 18th century, the glory days of Henry VIII's Jewel House were a distant but vaunted memory. The prevailing mood regarding the country's treasures was a sense of loss. In 1762, a biography of Cardinal Wolsey describes a reception at Hampton Court for the ambassadors of Francis I. So we're in the 18th century, flashing back to the 16th century. And the writer says that the ambassadors were entertained with a cost and a sumptuousness utterly unknown to modern times. Banquets, balls, tournaments distinguished every day. And he goes on to say, the presence chamber at Hampton Court exceeded all the rest. Here was fixed a sumptuous canopy, under which was a table placed by itself for the cardinal. So this is not Henry VIII, this is Cardinal Wolsey. Here were great buffets and sideboards loaded with gold and silver, which cast such a brightness by the reflection of the tapers as was quite astonishing. The French ambassadors, who were so charmed with the splendor of what they saw and the sweetness of the music they heard playing on every side of them, that they seemed wrapped in heavenly paradise. So this is really what you want out of ambassadorial entertainment. And one senses that in the 18th century they were a little insecure about their ability to be quite so ravishing, but they took that job quite seriously. And in fact, although the jewel office did have a fairly traditional court style for the silver that it issued, there were a few mavericks, one of whom was the 4th Earl of Chesterfield, who was a great and famous Francophile. He wrote the famous letters to his son describing comportment at court and how to sort of have the best manners but still get exactly what you wanted. They're very entertaining reading, and I recommend them. This is a marvelous and very sort of au courant style, very much in the French taste of the moment, and a little out of the ordinary for a jewel house issue. But it was made for the 4th Earl of Chesterfield's ambassadorial mission to The Hague. And he entertained in grand style in The Hague, and it was reported by the newspapers there, who said in 1729 that he gave a magnificent ball and supper to about 400 persons. 2 fountains of wine adorned with illuminations were running for the population. So the ambassador took care to impress the locals, in addition to the members of the host court. The music played until 3 o'clock this morning. So that this feast and entertainment for sumptuousness exceeded all that has been done of that sort by any foreign minister for a long time. In a word, the generosity and easy access of the Earl of Chesterfield have raised the admiration high and low of everybody, and everybody says there was never any feast like His Excellency's at The Hague. And we can contrast this for what we can imagine from a entertainment given by the king the year before at Somerset House. And this is the book that from which the Jewel House signed out the objects that were used at Somerset House to entertain the ambassadors from the States General. And it's the normal complement of buffet silver, 6 flagons, basins and ewers, a gilt cup and cover. But down here you can see that the cistern had to be borrowed. 2 cisterns had to be borrowed, in fact, because the jewel house didn't have magnificent cisterns of their own. So one gets the sense that, in fact, sending ambassadors abroad was a moment for great, lavish display, because that was the outward face of the nation, whereas some of the domestic entertainments held by George I or George II were somewhat more austere in their nature. And that would not be an accident. That would have been very carefully calibrated, not to piss off the exalted members of the House of Lords or House of or Parliament, who were keeping a close eye on the expenditure of the king. So I want to turn now a bit to Hanover, which is a subject that hasn't really been looked at that much, and the English forget that, of course, the 2 courts operated once George I assumed the throne in England. He kept a shadow court going full-time in Hanover, and in fact, George I required that there would always be a court operating in Hanover, very explicitly stated, so that money would not leave the kingdom. So it was a sort of a jobs program, I think, to make sure that he had a base of loyal courtiers in Hanover. This is the English were a little condescending when the Hanoverians first assumed the throne and didn't know much about Herrenhausen. So here in this landscape, which of course is in fact the portrait, the profile of the king embedded in the landscape. You can see the caption says, number one is the gardens at Herrenhausen, famous gardens laid out by Electress Sophia, the mother of George I. But then he says number two is the manufacture of boar's heads. Number three is ditto of hams. And then number three is the manufacture of venison. So clearly, Hanover was looked upon as a electorate that really had nothing much to recommend it in terms of manufactures, the one thing that the English were most proud of in the period. But in fact, when English visitors got to Hanover and saw the court, they were in fact impressed. And Mary Wortley Montagu said when she visited in 1716, the palace is capable of holding a much greater court than that of St. James's, and His Majesty dines and sups constantly in public. So the English were perhaps a bit chastened by the caliber of the court. Now this is a mid-19th century image of the silver from the Hanover buffet, which was in fact taken to Austria after Hanover was annexed by Prussia, but I show it just to give you a sense of the scale of the silver in Hanover that was preserved, in fact, right through the 19th century, very much intact. And the English, throughout the 18th century, throughout the 19th century, had nothing on this scale to present for themselves, in fact. The building up of the Hanover buffet had been greatly enhanced by George I when he was before he was crowned king as Elector of Hanover. So he was here buying Hanover silver, the coat of arms under the electoral bonnet here, and he bought a pair of cisterns and fountains in about 1705. Which are actually on loan and really we're seeing at the Frick. And you can see, I think, if you're familiar with English silver, that there's already a strong influence in English taste. And one senses perhaps that that's not an accident. George I, as Prince, would have known that he was very likely to take over the throne of England, and certainly that his aging mother would not be the first one to assume the throne. And this extraordinary wine jug was something that he inherited from his father, Ernst August, part of a set of at least 6. So already in the early years of the 18th century, the character of the Hanover silver is becoming pretty clear. It's monumental, it's quite geometric, it's not particularly sculptural, and those pieces that were made either in Hanover or in the neighboring town of Zell are not showing a strong influence of the French court style. George II, as Prince of Wales, also made a point of commissioning a large services of silver. Here, in 1717, he patronized, astutely patronized English goldsmiths for a set of at least 36 plates that are engraved with his crest as Prince of Wales before he was crowned George II. And we can see here a communion service equally austere and absolutely plain, but engraved with the same crest and made again in London. So this is very clearly Protestant silver, and I think George II is going out of his way to reassure the English that the Hanoverian succession is exactly what they wanted, it's exactly the right thing, and it is he is placating a large group of the population, among whom are observers like Celia Fiennes, who's the daughter of a parliamentary colonel, and she's describing in this quote the embroidered canopy of a throne room which had gold thread embroidered. And she says the canopy was so rich and curled up. It was newly made to give audience to the French ambassador to show the grandeur and magnificence of the British monarch. Some of these fooleries are requisite sometimes to create admiration and regard to keep up the state of a kingdom and nation. So it was completely understood that this level of pretense is a necessary evil, and we have to have these expenditures, even though they sort of hurt. And I think that's very much a thread that goes through English culture at the time. Another acquisition of George II as Prince of Wales was this massive cistern and fountain, which we believe he acquired from the Earl of Meath, whose crest and supporters are integral to the design of the cistern and fountain. He also commissioned this very austere and huge set of casters, which were made, as I said, in the town Celle near Hanover. Not quite English in their design, but very nearly a nod to English sensibility, and a set of these covered dishes, as well as a vast number of other pieces. At the same time, George II, George I were not buying silver on a massive scale for domestic use. And that, again, I think, is that they were extremely curtailed in their purchases by the watchful eyes of a feisty press and Parliament. George II really went to town in the 1730s when he acquired this silver furniture, which had been made, in fact, for his relative Maximilian Wilhelm von Braunschweig-Lüneburg for his Vienna residence in about 1726, and it changed hands a couple of times before coming to George II in 1731. It was kept, of course, in Hanover and not revealed to the English, but there's a pair of these tables. These are details from the tables and the mirrors, which are 7 or 8 feet tall. They're absolutely massive. But he didn't stop there. He commissioned a set of 5 silver chandeliers made in Hanover, but after a design that was sent from England, designed by William Kent. And there's some speculation that in the 1730s he was enamored of his mistress, the Countess of Yarmouth, Sophie von Walmoden, who was very much a figure at the court in Hanover. He was hoping to spend more and more time there, and that he thought he'd gussy things up in honor of that. What's very interesting, I think, is that he's paying close attention to English design and having models from England, wood models, in fact, sent over to be executed in silver. So he also ordered a set of 36 candlesticks, again executed in Hanover, but very much English in their design and taste. Although if you have one of them in your hands, they're huge and they're heavy, and you'd know right away that they're not actually English manufacture. So I want to go back for a minute to this group of silver that George II acquired as Prince of Wales, because it raises interesting questions about the connections between the court in England and in Hanover in this period. There's a fascinating inventory that was taken in 1747 and updated several times of the silver in Hanover that describes the commissioning of the chandeliers and lots of other interesting details at great length, with weights and particulars of the makers and how used and how stored. But this entire service, which was not inconsiderable, there were 494 kilos of silver and about almost 7 kilos of gold. So that's a substantial service bought by George II as Prince of Wales. This service is not mentioned in detail in this inventory. And the reason, it turns out, is that in 1738, it was very quietly sent from England to Hanover There's correspondence describing from England to Hanover, instructing the the Oberhofmarschall in Hanover to send a very discreet messenger to the port to receive a series of crates. And the messenger must be one of the most trusted servants of the household. And for some reason, the best they could do was a trumpeter, which seems ironic. And his name, furthermore, was even Lax, which seems even more ironic. But he made it to the port. He received the crates of silver, and they contained this entire service. And they also contained a large group of gold, which was otherwise unrecorded in the jewel house inventories. Now, it had been considered in London the sort of private property of the king, and not therefore subject to the inventories of the jewel house. And this was all supposedly above board, but I think it's very significant that it was rather secretly snuck over to Hanover. And you can see that here already, this is a Jacobite newspaper in 1716, where they are fretting about the treasure that's being spirited away from the country. So in 1716, such numbers of wagon loads are sent away from St. James's as the like was never known since there was a palace in Britain. The silver cistern, which King Charles II fixed in the ward, I think that's meant to be 50 or 40 pounds weight, is pulled down and gone. We hear that His Majesty takes with him 2 million sterling. So these are Jacobites admittedly writing it. But there's great anxiety that this national treasure is going to be siphoned off and sent to Hanover. So it's part of it is about the value of the goods, certainly, but it's also about the wounding of the sort of national pride. So included in the silver that was sent in 1738 to Hanover is this gold place setting and a number of other pieces now in private collections. The only English royal gold that we know of the period. So a great treasure that was secretly evacuated from the country. So, in addition, the couvert, that's the table service, plate, knife, and fork, have the cipher of William III, and were marked in 1691. And there's also an extraordinary service of cutlery in gold that were made for Queen Anne and her husband George, Prince of Denmark, before her accession to the throne in 1702. So it's a little hard to read the subtext about this maneuver of the transfer of silver, but I think it says quite a bit about the royal household in England and the meaning of gold and silver. These pieces were under the care of the jewel house unless they were kept in the private chambers of the king. But clearly, there's a sensitivity about where these treasures, who's responsible for these treasures. And I think the English citizenry is watchful. They are looking carefully for a misstep, exactly such as this one, which seems to have escaped notice, in fact, until it was uncovered by the Sotheby's researchers in advance of a sale at Marienborg in 2005. So there's an awareness that these treasures are not something that should be lost to foreigners. They should not be melted down, and they should be maintained. And I think here we can see perhaps why George I and George II, and indeed George III, whom I haven't had time to sort of address, are so focused on the issue of building their silver. George I visited Hanover after his accession to the English throne a few times. George II more regularly, I think 11 or 12 times over the course of his reign. George III never visited Hanover, although he commissioned a vast and extremely expensive service not even patronizing the English goldsmiths, but patronizing Parisian goldsmiths and Hanoverian goldsmiths. There's some discussion that he intended to spend more time there as he grew older, but indeed it never happened. But the court in Hanover, as I said, functioned independently as a shadow court. And they remained electors of the Holy Roman Empire. And here, in this image of 1764, this is the feast celebrating the election of Joseph II as Holy Roman Emperor, and a transaction that was witnessed by the electors of Mainz and Trier, Cologne, Bohemia, Bavaria, Saxony, Hanover, and so forth. And each prince brought with him his own buffet of silver. He brought his own wares with him to be set up behind his own table, individual tables with an individual chair, so they're all ranked according to their status. And he even brought his own carpentry on which his silver might be displayed. So, of course, the electors of Hanover are aware of keeping up to date their silver. The English may not have been had a moment of such sort of competitive display. They concentrated on their showmanship while their ambassadors were stationed abroad. But the electors of Hanover within the principalities of Germany were very aware that they had to maintain their stature. So I think it's a bit of insight into how the sovereigns themselves, but also the broader population, perceived these gold and silver treasuries, part indeed of the national identity and part of the patrimony. Thank you very much. I hope you'll have a chance to see the exhibition.